Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we finished off the functionality within our signup form. And in this video now, we need to think about how to actually style this component, but also at a high level, whether or not there is any componentization that we can do. So one of the things and patterns that I want you to think about when working with different components and different features is the most important thing is to build in the functionality first. You don't really need the styling as much as you need to make sure that the actual functionality of the component works. Once you have the functionality in, then you can start thinking about styling and all of those things, knowing that the hardest portion of your code works. So now that we have the functionality in, let's think about these different HTML elements that we have and how they might fit in a larger application. So when we look at our final application here, we see that we've got in some very basic form fields. But when looking at the actual final format, we know that here what we've done is really just work on the sign up page. What we do need is also a sign in page, which means that we're actually sharing these different form inputs. So what we want to do then is we want to genericize these inputs because as we see, we're also using it in 4 different places within the same component anyways. So this gives us a good chance to think about moving this into its own component. So to start this, let's go into our components folder and let's make a new folder. I'm going to call this form input. And inside of form input, I'm also going to make this form input.component.jsx. And because we know we're going to need to style it, I'm going to make a form input.styles.sass. So here, what I want to do is inside of the component, let's think about just copying this over for now, and then we'll talk about styling the component. So I want to do a const form input equals a functional component that just returns what we have in here so far. So as we see, we don't have a handle change and we don't have a value. So what we can do is inside of the props, we can pass through a display name value because that's also going to go into this label. So let's actually be very explicit in calling that label because we know that's what this will be. So other than a label, what else is there? There's a handle change. So let's call this a change handler. And then for the value here, we can just explicitly say value. And because we know that this value and this value overlap, there's also this name, and we can even put name to overlap. There's this required text, which makes it something that the input takes in as well. What we can do is actually, we can spread through the values and use this like a normal input. So other than the fact that we have this change handler, we can even call it onChange. In fact, I can even be more explicit in the sense that I know that this component is going to be used like a regular input, except it has some functionality where we have perhaps a wrapping higher level parent component, which should get rid of this warning as we see. But also all of these properties here, the type, the required, the onChange, the name, the value, I am just going to use them directly on this component in place of a regular input component. The only thing that's new that doesn't go into this is going to be label. Everything else though, I just want to spread this in as other props. And because I'm aggregating them here, now I can just spread them through like so as these other prop values to go on this input. And this now should be able to be used to replace what we currently have. Let's just make sure. I want to take this component. I want to import this in here. So I'm going to import in form input. I've misspelled import. I want to import in form input from form input component file. And then what we'll do is, as I mentioned, we know that we need this display name. So all these inputs, let's first just replace them with our form input component. And then I'm going to put a label. And this label is going to point to this label value. So go ahead and do that for all these other form inputs. For here, I want to do label goes to email, as we see here, like so. I'm going to get rid of this one. This one will be password. So let's capitalize password. And then instead of here, again, label will be confirm password. So if we save this, at the very least, we should see that everything here still works. In fact, just because we put it in its own div now, for each one of these groupings, we actually see that it's even shifting into its own form. So here, if I just type these through, as we can see, everything still works. Awesome. So now that we have this, let's start actually styling this. So there's, again, a couple things that I'm going to show you in terms of the actual Sass I've already provided, and it's a pretty extensive Sass file. So what you need in order to make the Sass file work, though, we can walk through. So first, we have a div with a class name. And this class name, I want to say group, because it's essentially grouping the form input together. And then, as far as this label goes, this label, you can give something of a dynamic class name, because if you look at the functionality of this, what happens is that it shrinks up or it doesn't. So let's talk about some functionality here. This class name value typically is a string, but you can render string in JavaScript, which means that you can actually say that for this class name, I want to render some string interpolated string where the value inside is going to be dependent on this other props value. So in other props, if the value dot length is there, meaning that if the user has typed something into this input, that means that I want the label to shrink. When that happens, meaning that this length is greater than 0, so you can either be explicit about it, or you can just say as long as it exists, because 0 in this particular context actually evaluates as a falsy value. So this ternary operator is going to see this as false when length is 0. When it's greater, it's going to see it as true. So we're saying if the length value is truthy, then I want you to append this shrink class. Otherwise, just don't do anything. Or you can even just say append an empty string. And then outside of that, we also know this is a form input label, which is another class that we just want to add to this so that we know what this label is. And now, inside of the input, I also want this to have a specific, let's say, class name, and I want to call this class the form input itself. The other thing we know is that if there's no label, then don't render a label. And here what we can do is we can just wrap this inside of these squiggly braces, and we can just say that if label exists, then render this label. So now if we save this, and inside of your form input styles.sass file, just paste in the Sass file that I've provided for you in your resources folder. So now that we have in our styling, let's go back to our form input component and let's import in that styles file. So let's save this and now go back to our application. And here we see we have our styling. What we'll notice though is that this display name is not moving up. It does move up once we start typing, but we do also want it to move up when we actually start selecting. So how do we do that? Well, I've actually included the styles for you inside of here, and it's specifically this selector, this CSS selector. Essentially what this code says is that for this group element, which is our top level div, inside there's a form input. If you focus on the input, meaning that if it's selected, I want you to find the next sibling or a generally subsequent sibling with this class and then attach that shrink label mixin, which is what creates the label shrinking effect. But here we notice that our input is actually below the actual label, which means that the subsequent selector is not going to work. because the selector is looking for a general sibling component with this form input label class after the input. So in order to fix that, we just need to move this input above the label. And now if we go back, we'll see that once we select display name, it works. And we also notice that it's also working with this text that's been auto-populated. So there we go. We now have our form input component that's now reusable. And we've also learned a little bit about different ways that we can compose and actually structure our components so that it's a little bit more intuitive when it comes to how we set up this input. What you can also do, if you want to be more explicit, is actually pass an object that has all of these values as some kind of, you can call it input options. You can do that as well. Both are actually viable options. It's really up to you how you want to do it. But personally, because I'm the only person using this application, I'm going to do it this way. I can show you quickly what the other way entails. All it would be is that here for this form input, label, of course, being label, here you can create something called input options as an object. And this would just be equal to this. And instead of these equal signs, we can just do this, except for type text. This one should be kept. Oops. Actually, like so. We just also have to add commas to these values here. And instead of interpolating it, we can just directly put these values like so. And of course, this being an object, we have to double wrap these and then required equals true or colon true. And now let me just comment these out. I just want to quickly show you this format. If I comment these out now, you'll notice that this input options here is being passed as an object. So now what you can do is you can go into your form input component, and instead of spreading all these other props, you can just get this input options object. You can do it like this. And now if you save, we'll go back. We should see just the one display name, but we notice that everything works as normal. What's the advantage of doing this format versus the other props method? You do have a bit more of a clear separation between what is associated as your input portion versus the actual label portion. So the label portion could even be label options if we had nothing more than just the label. But in this particular case, it allows us to very clearly define, oh, there's a difference between the props that we're getting related to our label and then all the props related to our input. So this is also a very viable way that you can do this kind of separation. Personally, it's up to you. Again, when you're working with different teams, you can make different decisions on which one of these you want to move forward with. I personally just prefer this way. And let's just move this back into what we had before. There we go. Okay. So now that we've genericized our form input, we need to style the rest of our sign up form itself, and we can also work on the sign in form. So that's what we'll do in the next video.